Hello and welcome everybody, I'm One Proper Variant and this is Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 11, Employment and Qualifications. This one is an exciting one because it basically explains something that was of course a thing in Victoria 2 but worked fundamentally differently, and honestly, as it approaches this from a fundamentally different approach, I was also proven wrong. I want to bring that up later, just already want to foreshadow it, if you will. Now the interesting thing about this is that this is basically all about how do you build your society, and this was of course a big focus in Victoria 2, but in Victoria 2 there was a lot of min-maxing as a focus of the gameplay because, all of the games back then, including Crusader Kings 2, including EU3 and so on, were primarily board games in which you can win if you, just perform the best. And Victoria 2, with all of its ambitions, sort of still said, yeah, there is of course an optimal ratio of X and Y, and all of that, you either have the optimal ratio or you are making a very bad decision because it doesn't give you more gameplay opportunities, it just sets you behind everybody else in the competition. Now, this one is interesting because of them choosing a different focus here, which is very, very positive from my point of view. I also do want to say we're going to go through the infrastructure dev responses as well as the comments that you left. There are only I think, maybe 4 or 5 comments. I just gotta tell you, there were many, many comments under that video, but most of them basically agreed. Most of them basically said, yeah, this is pretty good. I like to see this. I like the impact of this. So I have to say, hey, there's not that much to discuss there, but, hey, that's just how it goes sometimes if there is a decision that everybody can agree with. Now, let's talk about employment and qualifications. This week, we will be talking about pop professions, specifically how and why pop change profession. While this is an automatic process, the mechanics of it is still crucial knowledge to keep in the back of your mind when building your society. Perhaps you want to ensure the population in one of your states are able to take on mechanist jobs before embarking on a rapid industrialization project there, so you would basically, educate them, you would give them a certain amount of wealth, and then they can do that, right? Or perhaps you want to ensure you don't accidentally enable too much social mobility in a country already prone to uprisings against their true and lawful king. That is a really interesting perception, of course. Now, in Victoria 2, basically we're looking at a situation where not industrializing was always a mistake. There's no benefit from doing it. Of course, in Victoria 3, it will still set you back. It will make it so that your industrial and military capabilities are lower than they could be. But if you want to keep it together on a social, on an internal level, then now all of a sudden, different from Victoria 2, you have the opportunity to say, you know what, I will forego industrialization, at least for the moment, or the wide-ranging industrialization that I could be doing, and instead focus on doing it in a way where I can keep things in balance. The reactionaries, the conservatives will remain in control, rather than anybody else that comes in and says, have you heard of a republic? The French tried it and they then kept beheading everybody, but let's put that aside and do a republic. You don't want that, you want to be king. So I like the opportunity here that they're basically given to players to say, hey, I want to be a monarchy, I want to be whatever the hell I want to be, and I want to take it slowly but still succeed on an international level, even if I delay industrialization to a degree. Now, here's the interesting part and where I was wrong. Pops have a profession which determines their social strata and influence a number of things like wages, political strength, and interest group affiliations. In the Buildings Dev Diary, we learned that buildings need pops of specific professions to work there in order for them to produce their intended effects on the economy and society. So this is fundamentally already different from Victoria 2. I mean, we have the example where bureaucrats, of course, need to exist in Victoria 2 to a certain percentage. I believe 1% is the optimal ratio. But then we have a situation where, factories are basically just people that work there, so the, actual craftsmen, and then, everybody that is a clerk, I believe. Honestly, I forgot what the type was, but it was an 80-20 split. I do remember this. I haven't played Victoria 2 in ages, but I've played so much all over the years that basically I think I remember this quite well. 80% works craftsmen, and then 20% I think it was clerks, but it doesn't need to be clerks. I'm not entirely certain. Either way, what I'm saying is that this is gone. Of course, now you have things like, hey, you work in a textile manufacturing plant, and depending on the production method, that can require X pops or Y pops, and, all of these have a different effect. A pop of a bureaucrat type may have a different effect in a certain set of circumstances compared to another. If I do a production method, then the laborers, or rather the worksmen there that are actually in that factory may have a different impact on what is produced and what is needed to produce, just based on the fact of your production method, right? That is usually different from Victoria 2. It really showcases that they are focusing less on the, hey, let's optimize your industry, make you strong, and make it so that you can dominate in the world, and rather say, why don't we make it so that you need to worry about your internal politics significantly more, because that is, of course, the focus of the game. So yeah, this is very interesting. Now, how do pops get assigned to these spots? Victoria 1 and 2 has the concept of a pop type, a fundamental property of pops in these games that defines most aspects of their existence. What function they perform in society, what goods they need to survive versus what goods they desire, what ideologies they espouse, etc. I have to say, I want to say this right now before we dive deeper into the difference between professions and pop types. In previous dev diaries, basically in all of the previous coverage that I have done of Victoria 3, I have always referred to them as pop types, not as professions. And I've done that out of habit, because that is, again, how Victoria 1 and 2 did it. Man, I remember Victoria 1 so dearly. I remember doing so much modding in that game. By the way, listen, here's the thing. That is obviously no longer adequate. Both the profession and what that means for the pop type, so the pop type, ideologies, what goods they desire, and so on and so forth, and their social standing, the strata and whatnot, all of that differs significantly compared to the professions, which appear to be much, much more fluid. You can pull them back and forth between these different stages. We're going to see that in a second as well. But that is very interesting to me, and I will just simply say, I remember I, in a different video, stated that somebody suggested, hey, we could have local law applications, basically, or we could... No, somebody else, actually. These were two different comments, now that I think about it. They said, what if we had the pop-type lawyer? And I legitimately said back then, hey, this isn't really a thing. This isn't the game genre where they depict professions. They depict general pop types that cover various professions. Like an academic could also be a lawyer. They could do something that is a very similar task. Now, obviously, I'm wrong about this. Pop professions are a thing, and while they honestly, to me, when I look at this, when it comes to the archetype of them, I'm pretty sure they're basically just more fluid and more, more in general, pop types. I do think they do differ significantly from pop types in Victoria 1 and 2, because again, that was basically set in stone. You would look at somebody that is a farmer, for example, and they would be exactly what they are. That farmer could be expected to, most of the time, be conservative. If they were to, go out of that and become somebody that works in a factory or become more wealthy, become an aristocrat, their leanings would change and adjust to whatever pop type they now had become. And obviously that isn't really realistic. I did approach it mentally from that angle, but professions do it differently. Now let's take a look at how it goes. Pops in Victoria 2 autonomously changed into other types over time depending on their finances and the various needs and aspects of the country. Providing access to luxury goods in your country permits pops to promote more easily. Generally speaking, higher tier pops will provide better bonuses for your country as different pop types perform different functions. By manufacturing or importing special goods and educating your population, you would turn your simple backwards pops into advanced progressive types in ideal ratios, which maximizes these bonuses to increase your competitive advantage. Let me think here. I think you wanted, so what we have here are the Victoria 2 pop symbols. These are aristocrats and so on and so forth, right? It's listed here as well. Artisans, bureaucrats. The artisans were basically always bad. You wanted to get rid of them as soon as you started industrializing, because the artisans were competition to your factories, and you needed the factories to be more efficient in the long term, meaning that you needed the artisans to be outcompeted, essentially. Now, you had 1% bureaucrats that were required. I believe the thresholds for clergy are 2%, and 4%, and I'm talking about vanilla here, of course, not HPM or HFM or whatever other variations are out there these days. What else did we have? I think you needed 0.2% of the offices for an ideal ratio. And in the factories, as I mentioned earlier, we had we had clerks and craftsmen, and they were 80% craftsmen and 20% clerks for the ideal ratio in a factory. Now, what you're going to see here is, and in this explanation, and in me knowing these numbers, despite not really, I mean, I play it like every now and again, basically once a quarter maybe. It's not very common. I'm not that interested in Victoria 2 as the game is right now, but that's not to say the game is bad. I don't think it is bad at all. What I'm saying is, there's a lot of, hey, I really need to achieve these arbitrary numbers to achieve the optimal numbers, and if I don't achieve the optimal numbers, I don't gain anything from it. There's no payoff that I really get from it. Instead, it just throws me behind, makes it so that, you form Großgermanium, and then Großgermanium is only, second in industry? That's embarrassing. Of course, you want to go and you want to be first in industry by ratioing the actual percentages there properly. Now, in Victoria 3, that will be different. Let's check it out. Victoria 3 pops instead have professions. These are in some ways similar to pop type, but the ideal ratios and economic functions of those professions differ differ based on the building they are employed in and their production methods activated. The fundamental difference between these two approaches become clear when considering the bureaucrat pop type profession in Victoria 2 and 3. In both games, bureaucrats increase a country's administrative ability, but in Victoria 2, pops promote into bureaucrats independently in relation to the amount of administrative spending the player sets, while in Victoria 3, pops will only become bureaucrats if there are available bureaucrat jobs in government buildings, usually as a result of the player actively expanding government administrations. Now, if you've played Victoria 2, this particular paragraph may make you think, wait, but if I don't have a guaranteed bureaucrat class, because they only become that if they, have to work in that job, or rather if they find a job in that building, does it mean that, like, their effect of the ideology and whatnot, and the influence that they had on liberal ideology, for example, and conservative ideology, that just goes away because there are no... No. The answer is, that is untrue, because that is now separate. It's a huge step, and I had to process that a bit, I will admit it. I read this diary, and I was very intrigued, but I thought to myself, in Victoria 2 at the very least, you can always tell, okay, where's somebody coming from, why is their ideology this way, because they are deeply connected to pop types. In Victoria 3, it is much more interesting and much more agile, because you can be a pop profession and have a completely different ideological motivation, wealth status, etc. from the other people that are the same pop profession, because hey, not everything is the same. If you are in a company that requires you to be a mechanist, you might be in a position where you are more similar to other, what is it called, not mechanists, it's called engineers, right, of course, engineer, come on. You might be more similar in your ideology to other engineers because your general life experience is more similar to those engineers. In Victoria 2, that is unthinkable. Basically, you had, of course, the people that work in the lower strata, you have the people, the farmers and the laborers that work in your RGOs, you have the craftsmen that work in your factories, and they have particular leanings based on that pop type. Now, in this case, I'm super excited, and of course, this is one of those things that you can't confirm unless you actually see it in action, but I'm super excited for the fact that now we can actually have something that is very much reminiscent of how it was in real life. Let me just give you an example, right? In the time period of the Kaiserreich, so 1871 to 1914/1918. Let's, discount the First World War because, of course, that's an extraordinary position. But basically what we had were so-called paternal autocrats. And what I mean by that is, basically, you're a company owner and you say, hey, I've heard of socialism. It's pretty bad. I don't like it. They want me to die. Now, what I'm going to do is, as this private factory owner, I'm going to pay for your health insurance, for your pension insurance. I'm going to educate your children. But you have to promise me that you don't join a union, that you don't go and, for example, join a political party that demands social democracy or socialism. A very common example quoted on this is ThyssenKrupp, of course, so Krupp in this case, who definitely did that. This was this paternal, hey, I come in, I take care of you, and you don't do anything evil, right? Against me, I should say. In Victoria 2, this couldn't be reflected, because basically the people that actually work in the factories, the actual workers there, would always tend to be more progressive on an economic, on a social level. So, I mean, social level is always like a bit of a different topic anyway. Primarily, of course, it was about the material situations of theirs. So they would be voting SPD, for example. They would go into the KPD, so the people that were communists and social democrats and socialists. And that is interesting to me, because you couldn't simulate what Krupp did back in the day in Victoria 2. These people would just be unhappy. Unless you actually grant them proper reforms, they would just be incredibly unhappy. In Victoria 3, since that is now disconnected, you could totally have people that work in your companies that are paid well because you have a lot of, income and whatnot. And these people could be conservative. They could say, I'm being taken care of. I love this. I really, really do. I had to think about this a lot. I will say, this is my own failing, basically. I had to think about this a lot because I was coming in from a very Victoria 2 inspired and focused point of view, but this is actually a much larger change, a much more positive change than I had originally anticipated. Now let's go through the icons here. Academics, aristocrats, bureaucrats, capitalists, clergymen, and this will be changed to be more universally applicable. I wonder what they're going to do there. Maybe just praying hands, Civ style, right? It's just like going to be praying hands or something. Right here we got clerks, engineers, farmers, laborers, so these were the RGOs. In this case, I assume they will be on the subsistence farms and mines and whatnot, that sort of stuff. Then we got the mechanists, officers, peasants, servicemen, shopkeepers, and slaves. And no longer, no, I don't know the actual stats here, right? But basically, not only can they now be different in how they perceive the world despite having this profession, so not all types of this profession will feel the same, but on top of that, you will be in a position where all of a sudden, for example, you don't want exactly 0.2 officers in your country. Right? You don't want that because based on the building that these officers might be working in, the effect of officers may be different. So you might want more, you might want fewer officers depending on what the building does. It is a great change. Seriously, in my opinion, this is a truly outstanding change. The latter approach gives the player more control over where the job opportunities are created, and combined with production methods cause demographic shifts to have stronger, more localized effects that are easier to predict and understand. It is also more flexible, permitting the same profession to cause different effects in different buildings, given different production methods. So in Victoria 3, higher paid pops don't, by their very nature, perform a more valuable societal function than lower paid pops. Rather, each acts as a crucial part of a production method's recipe. Each of these roles require the other to be effective. Without enough laborers to shovel coal, the engines the mechanists maintain stay dormant, and without seamstresses to work the sewing machines, the shopkeepers don't have any clothes to sell. Isn't this is great, honestly. I'll just say it. I really am a big fan of this. Now, buildings adjust their wages over time in order to achieve full employment with minimal wage costs. As employment increases, so does the throughput, so the degree by which the building consumes input goods and produces output goods. By the laws of supply and demand, this makes a building less profitable per capita the closer to full employment it gets. So at first blush, it might appear irrational for a building to pay more wages just to reduce their margins. But since a building does not represent a single factory, but rather a whole industrial sector across a large area, and we assume the individual businesses in that sector compete with each other rather than engage in cartel behavior to extort consumers, this adjustment of wages to maximize employment makes sense. However, buildings won't increase wages due to labor competition if this would cause them to go into a deficit, so there's little point to expanding industries beyond the point where they are profitable. So this is... Now, we talked about this in particular when it comes to the topic of companies. This is, and I will just say that, and I think it's still a perfectly functional system. I think this is what basically guarantees that there can even be an economic system in Victoria 3. Again, this wasn't a topic for Victoria 1 or Victoria 2 either, so I can't really say that I expected it to be here, but we did talk about companies. And companies don't exactly always play fair. Most of the time, we have a situation where, a company goes and says, hey, I'm going to drive you out of business because I have a treasury background, so I have a lot of money in the bank, and with that money, I will put my prices into the negative, for example, so that I actually have a loss whenever I sell something, but at the same time, while I do this, you're going to go out of business. Because I'm going to attract all of the business of the other people that are now saying, hey, this guy offers it for cheaper, right? Now the other business goes out of business and then I raise prices. You can also do this if you want there's a lot of examples of this. You can also do this if you want, for example, just loyalty of customers. The most common example, especially since you're watching this video, since you play games, are consoles. Consoles effectively say, hey, the actual console price will be very low, and I believe both PlayStation and Xbox sell their consoles at a loss. I believe both of them do that. It definitely was true for the last generation. I'm not sure about Xbox One X. I honestly don't even know what the current Xbox title is, and PlayStation 5. I don't know whether it's true for them. But generally, they sell them for a loss so that you will then be locked into their ecosystem. Then you have to buy the games in their stores. You have to, primarily, of course, pay for their online services and whatnot. And you will not be purchasing the rival's console. That is the idea of selling a console at a loss. All of this will not be simulated from what we know in Victoria 3, neither that companies in particular exist and can become conglomerates and cartels or oligopolies or monopolies. No, instead, we don't have companies, and the topic of a business willingly selling something for a loss is also not a concept, because in the game, and it does make sense, it's very difficult for the AI and for the business to tell, hey, I will be driving out my rival out of business if I do this. How would they know? The calculations there are crazy. So I have to say, obviously, this doesn't account for how industry really works. It's an idealized form, but I do think this idealized form is the only way currently, and I hope that they're gonna go into companies and talk about that, because it was a big topic everywhere, both, in Germany, again, with the big steel giants, with the big industrial giants in the Rhine-Ruhr area, but also, of course, in the US. I mean, they had Rockefeller and whatnot. It's a huge topic. It's a massive, massive topic. Again, don't expect that to be covered, though. I want to make that clear. This paragraph essentially tells me that none of that will be in, because this, to have the economy function, this is an idealized version of how competition on a market works. And I think it's fine for starters, I think this works significantly better than CK2. Yeah, CK2 as well. No, Victoria 2. But I do also think, again, there's a big chunk missing there of why there may be problems in a market economy, because not everybody plays fair. At some point, you may have a market consolidation and then issues with it. But let me not bore you with economic details. Employees are hired into available jobs from the pool of pops that already exist in the state. But unless they're unemployed, these pops will already have a job somewhere doing something else. Pops can be hired under two conditions. First, they must be offered a measurably higher wage than the wage they're currently getting from their current employment. Second, unless they already work as the required profession in another building, they must also meet the qualifications of that profession to change into it. So, you're a company, you're a factory, you just created that factory, and now you're hiring people. You're looking around, what is the minimum price for a worker, so the minimum payment, the minimum wage that I can give to a worker for that worker to come here. And for that worker to be qualified for that wage in the first place, they must have stuff such as these steel mills don't pay as well as the arms industry, but they do seem to offer better terms than the textile mills and resource industries in the same state, with a notable exception of fishing wharves, who also need mechanists to serve their trawlers. So what we have right here is basically this switch. This steel mill currently has 6,000 employees, needs 10,000, and is hiring more, but at the same time, it's also losing some, because some of them are pivoting towards other industries. Right here we get more capitalists, so more investors. They basically come from being shopkeepers, they're rising up in the ranks into the from the textile mills. We got some engineers coming both from, the subsistence farms. So yeah, this guy is basically coming out of poverty. Opium plantations. Where the hell are we? I do wonder where we are. Opium plantations, really. Fishing wharves, sugar plantations. There's a lot of people pivoting, obviously, from being a laborer in the sugar plantation to the mechanists, because mechanists will pay them more and puts them into a position that they actually can achieve because they are educated enough. But we are also losing capitalists, so basically we're gaining 0 capitalists every month. We're also losing capitalists because we're looking at a situation where they are going into the arms industries. Maybe we're going into a war, maybe the arms industries are subsidized. Who knows, but they certainly pay quite well. Some engineers are leaving as well for the arms industries, some mechanists are leaving for that, and then some mechanists are leaving for the fishing wharves, who I can only assume also make bank. So basically, what we have here is just, this is the employment change. This is the overall thing, but all in general, we are gaining 34, mechanists to become engineers? Mechanists became engineers. Now I'm so confused. Alright, I thought this was like a summary. I don't think this is a summary. Is this an internal change? So does this mean that internally, without changing business, 34 mechanists became engineers? I feel like that might be it. I'm just looking at this. This is the steel mill they're currently hiring, and this can't be the summary of what is going on here. No way, right? No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think this is an internal change. Alright. Listen, I'm not actually certain. We're going to look at that in the next week, I'm sure. Wages are set by individual buildings in response to market conditions. A building that is losing money will decrease wages until it's back in the black. A building that has open jobs it can't seem to fill will raise wages until it either fills the necessary positions or runs out of excess profits, so when it would go negative if it offered a higher wage. As a result, different buildings in the same state will compete for the available workforce. What this means in practice is that a large population with the necessary qualifications to perform all the jobs being created in the state will keep wages depressed and profits high. Only when industries are large or advanced enough that they need to compete with each other for a limited pool of qualified workers are wages forced to rise. Yeah, of course. Hey, if I have a lot of people that can all do the job that I'm hiring for, I'm going to pay them nothing. I'm going to pay them peanuts. But if I have a lot of people that aren't qualified and only a couple that actually are, then, man, those people got power over me, don't they? This rise in wages also comes with increased consumption, which increases demand for goods and services that some of the same buildings may profit from in the end. Yeah, so it is... See, that is something where I'm like... I don't think it's necessary. I want to say this, but I do want to bring this up because economically speaking, it is an interesting thought. I don't think it is necessary to make an even more complex algorithm that may have the industry basically freak out and completely lose its stuff and just go bankrupt. But there is an argument to be made to pay a higher wage, even if it puts you into the negative, if that means that you can anticipate that more people will be demanding the goods you're producing, meaning you will later on be earning more, which means it pushes you into the positive again. Again, I don't think it is necessary. I think the simulation works, but I do want to point out on an economic level, this is definitely abstracted. Much less abstracted than Victoria 2 did it. Much less abstracted, but it is still abstracted. I want to be clear here so that we're all understanding basically how it works. POP's qualifications measure how many of its workforce qualify for certain professions and updates monthly depending on how well their current properties match up to the expectations of the profession in question. For example, at least a basic education level is required to become a mechanist, while a much higher one is required to become an engineer. Conversely, the ability to become an aristocrat is less about education and more about social class and wealth. Buildings won't hire POPs who don't meet the qualifications for the profession in question. Right here, 981 mechanists qualify to become engineers at a rate of 4.08 per month. The literacy is nothing to write home about, but they at least meet the cutoff of 20%, aren't starving to death, and benefit substantially from already working in an adjacent field. All factors and numbers are work in progress. Alright, let's take a look at this. Monthly change in qualifications. Each month, plus 4.08 of the workforce qualified to become engineers, due to, from literacy, 22%, so they got literacy 22%, which adds some speed there. From wealth, 11, so that's 0.55. From being mechanists, which is already related, of course, to being an engineer, and then the total is multiplied with the total amount of the workforce size here, as you can see. So 981 become 0.998, and then we get 4.08 out of that, so 4.16 times 0.98 gives 4.08. Only POPs, and this is nice, I think this is a great tooltip, by the way, because it really explains what is happening here and why it is happening here in a very easily accessible way. Only POPs with adequate literacy can become engineers. What I would like to see here, though, I will say that, so they tell us here that there's a cutoff point of 20%, right? But here it doesn't actually tell us about this cutoff point. It just says adequate literacy. I wish it would say 22% qualifies because, you know, hey, we're talking about 20% is the minimum. Either way, potential increases with greater literacy and wealth. Mechanists and clerks have a particularly easy time becoming engineers. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If some paper mills required more engineers and this POP was being considered, only the amount of qualified engineers they've accumulated so far could be hired. Currently, that is only 85, not shown. If those 85 were all hired, this POP could then end up with only 896 members left in the workforce, of which 0 now qualified to become engineers. Since all recently hired engineers used to be mechanists, all 85 retained their mechanist qualifications. That is huge! Are you seeing this? It's huge! You're retaining the mechanist qualification. Furthermore, if 512 POPs of this POP qualified to be farmers before the hire, 52%, of the 85 of them who were newly promoted to engineers, 44 of those new engineers are also qualified to become farmers. That is so good. It's so flexible. The profession system, seriously, it's really, really good. It's just great. I don't know how to describe it differently, but the fact that they have these qualifications is insane. This is unthinkable in Victoria 2. Changing from one POP type to another POP type is it. You're not going to change it again unless your circumstances significantly altered. This is crazy good. To be considered for a job as aristocrat, a POP must have at least moderate wealth, and the more wealth they have, the faster they will develop this potential. Unlike many other jobs, literacy is not a requirement for being accepted into the aristocracy, but an education does make it easier. Bureaucrats and officers have an easier time becoming aristocrats than other members of society, while POPs who suffer discrimination on account of their culture have a much harder time. Finally, if a POP does not meet the minimum wealth requirement, they actually devolve any prior potential for becoming aristocrats. This means that down-and-out farmer nobles robbed for their land and forced to go unemployed, or perish the thought, become a wage laborer will over time lose their ability to return to the former social class. All factors and numbers are work in progress, of course, yeah. Each month, 0.3 of the workforce qualified to become aristocrats due to the 1.21 due to POP attributes. So we got wealth, okay, that's a positive. Literacy, 42%, yeah, it doesn't matter nearly as much. I mean, look at this, the effect of the literacy is actually much, much larger. This is just a one-to-one depiction, basically, and this one is much, much larger here, the literacy for the engineers ones. From being officers, of course, that gives a huge bonus. They are officers, makes it easier for them. From cultural discrimination, Sudanese. Are we in Egypt? Is this right before the Ottomans take Egypt? Or maybe this is the Ottomans? 0.025 from the work size force. Yeah, there you go. It's the same thing yet again. Which brings us to 0.3. Only POPs with adequate wealth can become aristocrats. Potential increases with greater wealth and to a lesser degree literacy. POPs whose culture faces discrimination take a much longer time. Yeah, it's -10. This is insane. Otherwise, it would be easy, right? But yeah, impossible basically for them. They can still become aristocrats, but at a much, much lower rate. Officers and bureaucrats have a particularly easy time becoming aristocrats. Yeah, that makes sense. Like all POP attributes, qualifications follow the POPs as they split, merge, move between buildings, migrate, and die. It's insane. It's honestly insane what this system means. So I talked about like the abstraction and how much it is fairly, like, it's not simple, man. It's still a super complex system, of course, right? But how simple it is compared to reality. But this one, Let me just read this out again. Like all pop attributes, qualifications follow the pops as they split, merge, move between buildings, migrate, and die. It's insane. That's insane. If you had previously developed a lot of potential bureaucrats in your country but ran into budgetary problems and had to shut down your schools, over time those pops who have already developed the qualification to become bureaucrats will die off and not be replaced by newly educated ones. You will actually have generational shifts in pop qualifications. That's insane. I didn't envision this. When Victoria 3 was announced, I didn't think they'd be willing and able to do this. This is outstanding. I love this. If your capitalists in a given state had been underpaying their local discriminated employees to the degree that nobody gained the qualifications to take over for them, and then some of these capitalists move away to operate a newly opened iron mine in the next state over, rather than promoting some of the local discriminated laborers to the newly opened jobs, they will simply leave the spots open and the mines underproducing until some qualified capitalists move in from elsewhere to take over. What do you want me to say? I think this is truly great stuff. I think the pop professions are insanely superior to pop types. Insanely superior. And it took me some time to think about this, because I looked at this from the Victoria 2 angle, as I mentioned earlier. It's just honestly incredible what the new gateway here is. And I think this really highlights the different focus that Victoria 3 has, where in Victoria 2, yeah, okay, you needed to take care of your population, what their ideology was, what their pop type was, how much they earned, how much they could, have their living needs and whatnot. So their general needs, the 3 categories, filled up. But in reality, hey, a pop was just what they were. That's just their pop type. That's how they're defined. That's the very basis of their existence. In this one, it's so multifaceted. It's intergenerational. It's inter pop sort of, involved there, where pops can have different qualifications that come with them, and a certain percentage of that pop has this qualification and that qualification, while a different part of that pop doesn't have that. It is honestly crazy good. I'm hugely excited for this. Qualifications are entirely moddable by simply providing the computational factors that should go into determining how the value develops each month. If you want to make a mod to split up the clergyman profession into individual variants for each religion in the game, you could make the imam profession dependent on the pop being Sunni or Shiite. See, originally, I didn't actually really think that this was, valuable. Obviously, it is valuable because you need people that are of your religion to not be discriminated against and to actually do your job. But at the end of the day, they all do the fairly same job. But it occurred to me that if you have somebody that could, for example, be Catholic, and they are Catholic priests, so they are part of the clergy there, right? Just because they turn Sunni doesn't mean they have a qualification for being an imam. So my idea here is that we might be looking at a situation where this mod might actually be interesting. Originally, I was like, why would I do that? It's like the same profession, but it's not actually, right? It's a different qualification that you would need for these different professions. It blows my mind. Honestly, I love this. I love the idea of all of this for the Sunless Sea mod that is in the work. That's going to be amazing, but let's not talk about that. If you wanted aristocrat qualification development to be highly dependent on the amount of unproductive arable land in the state the pop lives in, you could do that. An event option or decision that makes it faster and easier to educate engineers, but harder to educate officers for the next 10 years? Absolutely. It's just great stuff. Now, what we have here, a breakdown of all pops in Lower Egypt that qualify to become engineers. Of course, any openings will be offered to existing engineers first, and not all of the remaining qualified pops would actually be interested in the job, though if it was lucrative enough, perhaps some aristocrats on a failing subsistence farm would consider a career change. Alright, potential qualified engineers. Again, not all of these are actually going to turn into engineers. It's just a suggestion of who could be eligible to do it because they have the potential to acquire the qualification. Or rather, they have the qualifications to acquire this. We have clergymen. Yeah, alright. We got bureaucrats, aristocrats, mechanists, bureaucrats. I think, so looking at this, they're all Misri Sunni, so Egyptian and Sunni. And I love that they use Misri, by the way, instead of Egyptian. Very, very, very cool. Sephardim Jewish, also present here, of course. Now, I think what you probably want to go in here first, since we actually want to get engineers, is get people that probably earn less. And I have to assume, again, yeah, maybe the aristocrats, it's a failing sort of a situation going on there. Maybe they are in a position where you can really get them. But also the clergymen, maybe. I mean, it really does depend. The clergymen are in subsistence farms. That's very interesting. That can't be a high wage. No way. I think you could probably attract these people to become that. And 74 more items. Of course, much more of the population is qualified, but these are the largest chunks of it. Alright, the intent of qualifications is to signal to a player what capacity for employment they have available among any subset of their population. They cannot, for example, conquer a state filled with undereducated people that they also legally discriminate against and expect to immediately build up a cutting-edge manufacturing and trade center there. These efforts will be throttled by their inability to employ the locals into highly qualified positions, meaning they have to wait for members of their already qualified workforce to migrate there from the old country to take on any high-status positions created for them. But by building out their education system, paying bureaucracy to extend their administrative reach to the new state through incorporation, and changing their laws to extend citizenship to these new residents, they can start to build this capacity also in the locals. It's interesting to me that this paragraph does not mention culture conversion or religious conversion at all. Obviously, that must play a role, right? People change their religions, their cultures, it happens. And you can incentivize that, I'm certain. But that the main solution is to adjust to the people living there, or not incorporate it and not build anything there, really gives me the hope that we're basically looking at a scenario where we can say, hey, we got this situation, and we either have to deal with it, or we can just basically leave it on the side and not interact with the state, or rather not have the state be a part of our core industrial center, which is interesting. In CK3, in EU4, even, I mean, Victoria 2 actually did not suffer from that. I mean, Victoria 2 had bugs, a lot of bugs related to culture, like so many bugs, but don't worry about it, okay? It wasn't intended there either to have like this, oh yeah, I conquer Czechia as Germany, and all of a sudden Czechia is German, right? Doesn't work that way. Didn't work that way in this period, didn't work that way in Victoria, in CK3 or in EU4's period, but you know, whatever. But this really makes me wonder that we will have this nice, realistic, you have to deal with what you get, rather than just, yeah, okay, I'm going to convert all of Alexandria to be Turkish, or all of Alexandria to be British, right? Very nice. I like it. In summary, qualifications is the mechanism by which access to education and your stance on discrimination, in addition to many other factors, impact your ability to expand different parts of your society. It is also the mechanism that sorts POPs logically into the economic, and thereby political niches you carve out as you expand, ensuring your laws and economic conditions inform the social mobility of POPs based on who they are. It's quite subtle, and you might not even notice it's there, until you run into the challenges caused by rapid industrialization, mass migration, conquest, colonization, and other drastic population shifts. Next Thursday, we will finally get into how all of these economic activities translate into revenue streams for you when Martin presents the mechanics governing the treasury and national debt. This was an insane dev diary. That was an insane dev diary. Honestly. The professions are so much better. What we have in Victoria 2. And I feel personally, not just because of it's so different on the production side, but it's also so different on the pop side. I feel personally that Victoria 3 truly, and it's the first game that ever actually wants to... Listen, Victoria 2 has peacetime gameplay, do not get me wrong. But in Victoria 2, your ultimate goal is to build up so that you are proficient with the pop types that you need, so that they work properly, and then you can compete with that on the international scale. In Victoria 3, it really sounds like the actual society building, the nation building fact of this time period is the main driving factor of everything you do. Instead of going, I need more, craftsmen to get my factories filled with 80% craftsmen, you would be saying, I need to look at this region to see what the options are, what their problems are, how I can approach it, and how I can make it so that they maybe lean into the direction based on their wealth proposition, right? Into the direction that I need them so that I have a proper, coherent domestic society. This is really cool. I love it. Now let's move on to infrastructure. First, we do the dev responses. It turns out the PH logo was a placeholder. There you go. Canals for sure will be a thing, at least the major ones like Suez and Panama. Our aim is for all major rivers to provide infrastructure in varying amounts. The Rhine and Danube for sure count. There's at least a map mode where you can see market access of states, for example, which are lacking infrastructure. We may add more infra-related map modes depending on if we feel they fill a need. Yeah, alright. Infrastructure can indirectly impact international trade, but more on that in a later dev diary. It has been confirmed, and we're going to see that in a comment as well in a second, that basically trade and, stuff that comes via port doesn't impact infrastructure once it gets to that port and then would have to go to the market center. Interesting. I wonder how they balance that out. At the moment, we're focusing on economy and politics, but you shouldn't have to wait too many more dev diaries, so start hearing about other areas of the game now. Market capital is usually the political capital at start, but can be moved. The US is an exception, starting with New York as their market capital instead of Washington DC. Obviously, that exception makes sense. I do wonder why. I mean, yeah, okay, it's infrastructure related, right? But I assume it has probably to do with urbanization as well to a degree. I would love to know more about trade in general and why I am interested in my trade capital, or market capital rather, to be in a specific position. You know, hey, couldn't I just build up wherever it is and just, you know, get that done? What is the genuine benefit of it? The intent is for infrastructure to play a role in warfare, but I can't say more than that for now. I really want to know more about warfare, Wiz. Wiz, I drank beer with you in Berlin. Tell me the great stories about warfare, okay? I made that theory video about warfare, and I mean, do I think it's accurate? Probably not, but I definitely want a different approach. I think it's time to graduate, basically, from what we had previously. How expensive difficult is it to have 100% market access? It really depends on how heavily you want to industrialize compared to how much you want to spend on maintaining infrastructure. A better alternative to just having the same level of railroad everywhere could be, for sure, to create pockets of heavy industry and industrialization with weaker rail lines to the countryside, where a focus on rural buildings means you don't need as much logistical support. Very, very cool. Instead of having to build up the damn railway in every state, I can just say, hey, this is a subsistence farm. I don't care for it. It's not exactly that I don't, so this is about minor canals in the game, but it's just that if we're to have them, I don't want them to fill the exact same role as railroads. They should either be a precursor in an earlier start date, or to, for instance, wait, be a precursor in an earlier start date? Excuse you? Excuse you? We're gonna get Napoleon? Or to, for example, instance, not in the base game, just for the record, be a cheap alternative that is only available in certain places. Right. The idea is that if you have a rail, right, this is about the topic of supply. We talked about this before as well. We talked about it extensively in the community discussion, that the railway supply needs to be connected from your market capital to wherever the industry is. So if you have an industrial center in Novosibirsk or whatever, I don't even, is there like, I don't even know where Novosibirsk is, but if you have it there, and that has 40 infrastructure, and then the next state that connects you with the market capital has 10, that would mean 30 of that 40 market capital, of that market access is basically wasted. That infrastructure doesn't do you any good because it doesn't connect you directly to the market capital, since the adjacent provinces are god-awful. That's basically what's being explained here. Moving a market capital doesn't cost anything per se, but it does create some temporary penalties on the market due to the resulting upheaval. What happens if one nation... Who gets to decide how to move the market capital between markets that open up to one another and form the new market voluntarily? Who gets to decide that? What happens if a nation that has the market capital in their possession goes to war with another member of that market? There are so many questions that I have related to war and dominance. I really need those dev diaries. Infrastructure isn't all there is to it. There's also the naval aspect. Right, yes, so they don't use infrastructure for the trade, but there is more to it, whatever that may be. Probably trade routes. You need to have like a trade fleet, for example, and then transport it there. Will industries using goods produced in the same state have less infrastructure usage? There is currently no such effect, as we don't track exactly where the individual units of goods go, though we could potentially apply some sort of a discount based on how much of a building's needed goods can be locally sourced. I'll give it some thought. Thank you, Wiz. And that's it. Now let's move on to the community comments. Again, not that many here. And some of the community comments are basically just saying, hey, Wiz responded on Reddit. Here's what he said. Let's check it out. I think the clothing will get diversified throughout development, and even if it doesn't, I'm sure modders will quickly create mods that do exactly that. So we will have the community flavor pack in Victoria 3. El Tyrannos is an absolute beast, and I'm excited for that. So excited. The response here is, only thing I'm afraid of is clothing only DLC. So I genuinely do not believe that they're going to do that. And this isn't because I feel positive about... I think DLC structures for GSG, for grand strategy games, I've uttered this many times. I believe long-term support for grand strategy games is a fundamental requirement of the complex grand strategy games that we enjoy. I play so many other grand strategy games from other companies, and they do their best, believe me. They do their best, but since their fan base isn't that large that they can have a long-term support, instead of doing, hey, we can reiterate on this game within this game by doing DLC, they constantly have to make new games, and it just puts you in a position where you can't reiterate on old mechanics. So I do think it is important, but I don't think that we are ever going to see clothing DLC from Paradox again on its own. Hey, if I'm wrong, I will eat my words, okay? I do not believe it for the reason that basically, when you look at, for example, Stellaris, it always comes with functionality. You get these new ships and whatnot, but they come with new types of, whatever's going on. In CK3, for example, you're looking at the Northern Lords DLC, at the Royal Court, all of that stuff that is visual comes with other mechanics. It's combined, because that's the new approach that they were taking. CK2 was riddled with so many portraits, with so much nonsense, frankly. And I own all of them. Listen, I will tell you, I'll admit it, right? I own all of that, but I don't like that concept, I don't like that idea, and I think Paradox shares that point of view based on how their current development goes. I'm certain there will be more clothing, and it's very, very difficult. Again, we talked about this. If you have a soldier, if you have a samurai in Japan at the start of the timeline, and then they transform into the modern Japanese army, they very evidently, and they have to, wear different clothings. But I don't think this will be reflected, because, my god, for one nation, having this huge shift over a century of clothing, it won't happen, right? So, my point of view is we're probably going to have not that many clothings, but somebody also pointed out that the clothings, as they were with the top hats, they just identify their wealth, their means, their profession, that sort of stuff, right? And that's actually a good point. That makes it so that it is easy to read. There may not be a vested interest to have all that many clothing types, but I will say more can be good, should be good, and I think they will be coming, maybe, in included DLCs that are regional, or in included general DLCs. That is usually what their current structure is, just to bring that up. The fact that the infrastructure system will be connected from your capital to any part of your empire could mean that, hopefully, Victoria 3 will have a war system more similar to that of Hoi 4, which many would agree with is the best and most immersive of any Paradox games. There's a caveat there, let's talk about that in a second. I think that such move, and something that resembles the front lines of Hoi 4 at a smaller scale, would be great, and also adequately represent the immense importance of strategic railways and ports along the 19th and early 20th century. The Crimean, and I don't know why it took so long to read the Latin letters, or numbers. The Crimean and the Russo-Japanese War, and to a lesser extent the Franco-Prussian War, were mostly determined by the use of railways and transports to the front line. Please contact the developers and make a push for such a system. See, I had ideas long before this, right, where I shilled them. There's a video out there. Why, I think it's called something like, why Victoria 3's, it's a crackpot video, whatever, man. Crackpot theory. You will find it if you want to look for it. So when it comes to warfare, it's much more complex than that, and I don't mean that the system has to be complex, but frontline warfare was not a thing until the early 20th century. It wasn't really practiced like that. Mostly, you still had single army engagements. Sometimes you had engagements like the Prussian army, what they did against the French, for example, and against the Austrians, where they marched separately, but then fought together, that sort of stuff. But we didn't have, per se, front lines. Obviously, we had scout regiments. It was much more complex than I micro my army from A to B. That's not at all how war works. I just want to say that. Not in the Middle Ages, not during the Roman period, not during EU4. I hate that depiction, but don't worry about it, yeah? What I mean is, frontlines aren't always accurate. Hoi 4 is incredible on a military scale, but that is for its time period. I do think frontlines later on should be important, but I will absolutely mention that with especially early engagements, we're basically talking about a situation where armies know somewhere there is a different army, and then they raid, for example, different locations. They make sure that they have a good position for their camp and whatnot, and then they engage at some point, and that battle is incredibly decisive. But all of that, again, microing is way too primitive for that. I do agree with this comment on a very fundamental level that I want a graduated warfare system, whatever that may look like. It could be based on different locations, so different, hey, theaters, basically. It could be based on you giving your army a command that is like a micro command, but it works with a bit more granularity to it. It's difficult to explain in just a couple of sentences here, because it's such a complex topic. But yes, I personally do agree that when it comes to supply, and when it comes to supply of goods, and when it comes to the tactics that an army chooses, and how an army actually acts within a war zone, microing, especially like Victoria 2, when Victoria 2 micro was honestly cancer, it was so bad. But microing is not adequate. It is not adequate. And I do maintain that position. So I do agree, although again, Hoi 4 has the caveat of being very, very good, especially now with the rework of rail lines, right? Of being very good for its period. Hoi 4 captures the period very well, but, don't put that into Victoria 3 as is. You need to have it on a different level for Victoria 3. Just a heads up for next week's video. This time, Wiz actually answered a question on Reddit, and it is an interesting response. Basically, a user asked if at 100% market access, all goods would be the same price across multiple zones or multiple states and argue it wasn't very realistic. Wiz answered that initially the design was for 100% market access to be very rare for most of the game, but that didn't result in satisfying gameplay, so they changed it. I read that comment, by the way. I did go to Reddit. They're still considering other ways for local prices to be relevant even at 100% market access though. Yeah, I am interested to see the solution there. I think it works fine in the sense that the economy will work, and that is already a huge step up from Victoria 2, but I do agree, of course, if you have a localized industry, you still should get benefits from that industry being localized to wherever the supply is, you know? Hey, okay, you got 100% market access, but that doesn't mean that it actually is as cheap as just producing literally in the neighborhood of wherever that good is that you need to produce something, right? So yeah, I'll be interested in seeing what they're gonna do about it. I can understand the argument, though, that it might not feel very fulfilling. I'm very curious how infrastructure will be handled in colonies. Historically, infrastructure was primarily built up for the extraction of natural resources from the mine to the port, rather than transportation, goods, shipping between population centers. Perhaps a unique mode of production for railways and colonies that only provides infrastructure and not urbanization or the transportation of goods. I mean, I'm interested in colonies both for that, but also for the fact that I want to see how the port transport from colonies actually goes, because that will be huge, especially for the late game wars. Yeah, big question. I agree with, I'm interested in that. And I think this is the last one. Two things that confuse me. Firstly, will imports also use infrastructure? So from what we know, they won't. For example, if a state imports a lot of grain, will that use infrastructure? On these screenshots, it seems to not be the case, no. And secondly, if state A is connected to the capital through state B, will the infrastructure usage of state A show up in state B? Again, I don't see anything, no, so I don't think it will show up there, because it basically just asks, how do you connect to the market capital? Right? That's what it asks, rather than can we put all of this in there? And then from there it goes. I don't think infrastructure should be understood as like, this is basically the actual way of these goods over there. It's more just the capacity that a province can have. I think that's really where it comes from. Now, that's not a good description, but I do think that it basically is a bit more of an abstraction than saying we have a direct connection from A to B. It mostly says we can, yeah, generally handle X goods, you know, all of this is good, right? And then it just asks the general question, is there enough space to handle these goods, rather than how many goods are there in total? I do think it's fine, because otherwise you would have to have infrastructure values just for the route from A to B, on top of the state values, so that you could have different trade routes basically from locations of production to the market center. Could be interesting, but I will also say I don't think gameplay speaking it's strictly necessary. I get the concern though. We already had that bottleneck, right? Wiz actually confirmed on the Reddit that imports don't directly use infrastructure, stating correct, though imports have their own transportation needs we'll get into later. And that's it. I hope that you found this one interesting. I love this dev diary. I think the pop professions are insane. It's insane stuff. Let me know what you think. I think this is so far, and I mean, we've seen many step ups. I think the markets are a huge step up compared to Victoria 2, no doubt about it. But the value this has for building a society and for building industries compared to Victoria 2's really just your ratio game, this value is huge. An intergeneral shift in qualifications is crazy. That's just insane, honestly. Big fan. Yeah, I hope I got it right anyway. If I misunderstood it and it's actually worse than what I think it is, then that would suck, right? But I don't think so. I think I understood this right after thinking about it for a while. Huge fan. Let me know what you think. And with that, I would like to thank the members of the channel that are, of course, supporting the channel. But for now, I will see you later. Alligator.